Good afternoon. My name is Olena Hlazkova, and I'm happy to present at the International Conference on New Trends in Languages, Literature, and Social Communications. It is double the pleasure to present here today because Kryvyi Rih State Pedagogical University is my former alma mater, where I completed both my bachelor's and master's degrees. Today, I will be sharing with you a portion of my doctoral research, and will discuss a new trend in Ukrainian literature, which I propose to define as literature of migration. I will begin my presentation by outlining the corpus of my research, covering the main concepts that describe the confluence of literature and migration, and hopefully convincing you that it is an important topic worth our attention and further exploration. I will also outline my arguments in favor of the proposed concept literature of migration and provide my description of the literary body this concept intends to define. Since the early 2000s, during the fourth or fifth wave of Ukrainian immigration, Ukrainian literary writers have shown a renewed interest in the topic of Ukrainian immigration. Unlike their predecessors, however, contemporary authors appear to focus their literary efforts on the lived experiences of Ukrainian immigrant women. I've identified 19 publications that focus on women immigrants as central characters. Most of these literary publications are from small presses with limited print runs and represent contemporary women's writing, both in Ukraine and abroad. My research also revealed that some of the identified texts had already been studied by literary scholars and mentioned by sociologists. However, no single and unanimously accepted definition has been proposed to identify these publications as a new and distinct literary trend. I propose to use Adelson's term, literature of migration, as a thematic and descriptive term with which to analyze the recent literary phenomenon of these women-inspired and women-authored texts. Representing a variety of approaches, literary theorists and critics worldwide have discussed immigrant literature, marginal literature, interculturelle literatur, interlinguale literatur, Migrantenliteratur und Migrationsliteratur, migration literature, immigration diaspora literature, and literature of migration. I choose to focus on these specific concepts, and not on more recent ones, for the following reasons. First, they allow me to demonstrate the historical development and conceptualization of literature and migration confluence in a European context. This overview is relevant to the discussion of appropriate terminology in a Ukrainian context, considering the specific literary trend emerging in the country in the early 2000s. Second, this article focuses on writing about immigrants and immigration from the sending country Ukraine, which sets it apart from the concepts and perspectives on immigrant writers and writing elaborated by scholarship in receiving countries. In my view, these concepts are not interchangeable, even though some studies suggest otherwise. While all of them attempt to nuance theoretical frameworks in order to categorize hard-to-categorize texts, they present each term as representing a distinct understanding of the literature and migration dyad that mirrors the sociocultural and political climate of the author's country of origin. Author's origin and biography are key factors in how Jano and Roche define migration discourses and literature. Discussing the German context of migration literature, these two researchers use the terms Migrationsgeschichte and Migrantenliteratur. Both recognize migration literature as literary works produced by migrants, which indicates the status of the author in the country where their work was published. Referring to the wider European context of migration literature, Merol and Ponzanesi identify such texts as a literary corpus produced by artists operating beyond national parameters. Migration literature is defined through the author's dislocation and or absence from a national literary scene. The content category includes a definition by Stanisic, who in his discussion of immigrant literature defines it by the subject matter and in relation to the literary premises of genre, style, and tradition, and not by migrant writers' biographies and their origins. In his analysis of migrant literature myths, Stanisic argues that even though most migrant writers prefer to talk about their own migrant experiences, writing about migration is neither the only nor the exclusive topic of migrant literature. Similarly, in order to write about migration, one does not need to relocate to another country. Frank's thesis on literature and migration are based on Stanisic's field-broadening definition. He points out that the figure of the migrant first appeared in 20th century literature, which in turn led to an increase in the number of migrant authors who shared their own migrant experiences with global audiences. It should be noted that in his explorations of literature and migration, Frank uses the terms migrant literature and literature of migration interchangeably. While I accept both his arguments and his eagerness to review the first principles of the literary historiography of the literature of migration, precise terminology should be developed that adequately describes and classifies the literary corpus of migration. The role of language of writing in defining the literature of migration is represented by two interrelated and commonly interchangeable terms, interculturelle literatur and interlinguale literatur. These two concepts, similar to Migrationsliteratur and migrant literature, originate in a German context and focus on migration and not the author's experience as migrants. However, these concepts stand out as they introduce language as the defining element of the in-between space this literature occupies. In the Italian context, the term diasporic literature also refers to interculturality, defined as writings linked to the ex-colonies and those by authors from other countries, all expressing a transcultural condition. In her discussion of the marginalization of diasporic literature, Curti notes that bilingualism is a characteristic feature of literature written by migrants themselves or in creative tandem with Italian writers. Ideas about literature of migration are evolving at precisely the moment when categories of diaspora and national memory are no longer sufficient to address the changing relationships between diaspora communities and national states. In my research, I adopt Adelson's interpretation of literary structures partly in terms of their transfigurative historic significance, and believe that literature of migration is an evolving trend in both national and global scales. Therefore, concept literature of migration signifies a new historical stage in the development of writing about migration. Now more than ever, it is important to stop talking exclusively about immigrants or emigrants and their autobiographies as the main contributors to the literary corpus on migration. Literature of migration raises and embraces issues of hybridity, ethnicity, multilingualism, and inclusion into and exclusion from both host and home societies. In the Ukrainian context, the notion of immigrants literature refers primarily to diaspora literature. Interestingly, Zhiravska points to the inaccuracy of the term diaspora when defining literature by Ukrainian authors living abroad. This reflects the field's broader tendency to revisit and potentially revise meanings of existing terminology and its potential to reflect cogently on new features and trends. Zhiravska emphasizes the need for further scholarly discussion aimed at developing more accurate terminology and common criterion approaches to the study of this type of literature. To my knowledge, only a handful of studies explore the literary interpretation of contemporary Ukrainian migration processes. Skurtul, for example, offers a new classification of what she calls the literature of immigration discourse. She develops three main categories. First, literature of immigration, literature of diaspora. Second, literature about immigration, a larger literary corpus which includes both mainland Ukrainian writings and temporary immigrants, those produced by labor, academic, political, and other types of immigration. And third, literature of immigrant rhizome. Hanenko-Friesen explores Ukrainian fiction on the topic of Zarobichanstvo labor migration, focusing on the literature that appeared in the context of Ukrainian labor immigration to Italy. She compiles an impressive annotated bibliography of 82 publications, both prose and poetry, wherein the topic of labor migration is either central to the plot or constitutes an important component of the storyline. Hanenko-Friesen notes that authors of the identified publications write predominantly in Ukrainian. However, several texts are written in Russian and Italian. When trying to define these publications, Hanenko-Friesen opines that both terms fiction on the topic of labor migration and labor migration literature are too narrow to embrace the variety of discovered genre styles and themes. Instead, she proposes the term literature of post-socialist folklore realism and describes this type of literature as a transnational phenomenon. I find Hanenko-Friesen's term appropriate and applicable to the 82 publications she included into the bibliography. However, while the term references the identified origin of this kind of literature and a specific time period, alluding to the late 1990s, it may not be applicable to future texts that explore the topic of women's immigration from Ukraine in other decades under different social and economic circumstances. In my research, the term literature of migration allows me to differentiate the recent literary trend from the Ukrainian immigrants' literature of the 20th century and to reflect on several distinctive features of the identified texts. For instance, contemporary writing and immigration from Ukraine is described as popular literature largely associated with Zarobichanstvo. It is predominantly authored by both women with and without immigration experience. This literary corpus focuses on women immigrants and their migratory experiences. Several of the identified literary works are written in languages other than Ukrainian. And in fact, literature of migration freely employs a number of European languages. Thus, the literature of migration in the Ukrainian context describes a sizable literary corpus, which is fundamentally different from the corpus of immigration, diaspora literature. Well, that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And should you have any questions or recommendations, please feel free to email me to the email address you see on your screens. Thank you.